In the world of Starmer, there are two terrible things that mustn't exist. There obviously mustn't be anti-Semitism and there mustn't be Islamophobia. The trouble is, of course, that the people who are most guilty of Islamophobia are probably the Maccabi supporters, and the people who are certainly most guilty of anti-Semitism are a significant part of the Muslim population of this country. We need just to admit this.
With this demographic reality, this is the outcome you're going to be getting. It's true, probably, that there would be an enormous riot. To rage and rage about the police's actions here is, in some ways, neither here nor there.
Can we again be quite clear? White people do not have community leaders. There's very interesting studies, aren't there, been done since October the 7th in the astonishing rise of anti-Semitic attacks. We know why.
Hello and welcome to David Starkey Talks. This week David is talking to me, Laurie Wastell. I'm the associate editor at the Daily Skeptic, where I've interviewed David twice and had the pleasure of those very excellent interviews, of course. I also freelance for the Spectator and the Telegraph and other publications like that. So I'm very pleased to be here to talk to you today, David. What have you made of the week? What should we get into?
Well, I spent most of the last year, as you know, touring around with Mark Littlewood for PopCon. Mark and I have huge amounts in common. We have one thing absolutely not in common. Mark is a football fanatic. And the absolute rule between us was football should never, ever be mentioned. And to my shock this week, I think we're going to need to lead on football. We're going to need to lead on something I know absolutely nothing about. So you're going to have to guide me and comfort me and steer me. The extraordinary business of the decision of, again, can we get this body? I'm not quite sure which body it is. Yet another quango. I've got to read because is it the United Kingdom Football Policing Unit? Is it the where is it again? Is it the local safety advisory group that has decided and had its verdict endorsed by the West Midlands Police, that notoriously impartial force that upholds the values of equality before the law, that the forthcoming football match between I think it's Aston Villa, isn't it, the local Birmingham team, which has the wonderful motto, I gather, that here heroes are villains, and the Jewish football team, the Maccabees.
Why don't I just clarify the political workings here? So you're right. So it was the local safety group which took the final decision. There's been a lot of can kicking and really responsibility shuffling, but they were briefed by West Midlands Police. West Midlands Police, in turn, had been briefed by both the Home Office and the National Football Policing Unit,
which is the UK Football Policing Unit, which, of course, in theory, is it not the final body that decides on the allocation of policing resources? In other words, whether there can be cooperation between police forces, and that it has quasi-statutory authority, and it has actually been challenging the notion that politicians are capable of intervening in its rulings on the grounds that it would, as it were, obscure the actual order of responsibility. Anyway, so one of the things we'll be talking about will be this extraordinary business of the parking of what are fundamentally political decisions to allegedly non-political bodies. In other words, the supposedly operational independence of the police, the whole quangoification.
But also the attempt to latterly overturn that from Westminster by Starmer, which is very against his typical way of operating, of course, which I think...
Has he actually done so?
Well, he's certainly trying to as much as he can, yes.
In other words, what Starmer is trying to do for once is actually to interfere in this quangoification and, I suppose, therefore, assume political responsibility. But it's not clear, is it, that the Prime Minister can actually do this, and certainly that he seems at the moment to lack the political will to force it through. But can we just make one other important point. The very name of this Jewish football team, I think it's effectively it's the main football club in Israel, isn't it?
It's certainly a very prominent one, yeah.
Do you know why the name is so resonant?
I'm afraid you're going to have to enlighten me.
Right. Well, I can do it. For once, I can teach somebody on this subject. It comes from the book of the Bible called the Maccabees. These were the one aggressive military dynasty of the ancient Hebrew world and the biblical world. They are the subject of one of the great oratorios of Handel, Judas Maccabeus, which is the orator. This is just getting why the name carries the resonance that it does. The oratorio, Judas Maccabeus, was written immediately after the British state, the Hanoverian state, defeated the rebel Scots at Culloden. And it effectively, the figure of Judas Maccabeus is a representation of the Duke of Cumberland. So we're talking about a name which in our very own history, in our own British history, is about intercommunal, religiously driven sectarian violence. And the triumph of one group over another group, and again in our own history, the great warrior song, the Song of Triumph, from Judas Maccabeus, "See, the conquering hero comes," is used as the war hymn of the 18th century British Empire. If you go to the great monuments in Westminster Abbey, and more particularly in St. Paul's, where you see these gigantic statues by sculptors like Chantry and whatever, of the heroic youth of the late 18th century who died dulce et decorum est. It is a noble and fitting thing to die for your country in the service of empire against the French. When they had their moment of triumph, when they were alive or dead, the regimental band would play that number from Judas Maccabeus. So in other words, the very name of this club is invoking conquest and religious war. So again, I think, as you know, my sympathies are profoundly on the side of Israel, but the very name has that element. Would you now begin by explaining to me a little bit about the range of things that we can see here? I mean, again, help me, because I really am ignorant on all of this. As I understand it, there are two radically different views of what has happened or what might happen, depending on the feeble Starmer's, the success of the feeble Starmer's intervention or not. One is, let me continue from what I was saying about the name, the Maccabees. There is an argument from people like Ayub Khan and Mohammed Iqbal and Zara Sultana, in other words, the new MPs representing this effectively now independent series of Muslim political parties, that the Maccabee fans are in fact the equivalent of the direct expression of what they see as the aggressive military religious conquest of the new Israel. They cite the example of their behavior. I think it was in Amsterdam, and presumably was the rival team Ajax, which I think is the great Dutch football team, is it not? And there were again two readings of the event. One reading of what happened was that it was a new pogrom. The other was that it was a result of the extraordinary aggression of the Maccabee supporters in a city, of course, which has become, like all liberal cities, profoundly pro-Palestinian. So there are two sets of shots, aren't there? There's one set of shots that show Maccabee supporters tearing down Palestinian banners on buildings, and there's another of them that show them being savagely beaten up by groups of masked black Islamic and presumably far leftist Antifa thugs. That's a fair statement, isn't it?
Indeed, yes. So, if we put Maccabi Tel Aviv in football terms, I know that those aren't your terms necessarily, but it would be a little bit like an Israeli Millwall.
Exactly.
So, a club very much known for its hooliganism, and So, yeah, the question is over partly who was to blame for the terrible scenes that unfolded in November last year in Amsterdam. So it is true that it seems on the first night before the match that those supporters had arrived, they had engaged in some provocation, certainly like pulling down flags, and there were videos of this. But it is also true that the next day and after that happened, there were messages going around Muslim WhatsApp groups and things like this in Amsterdam, trying to organize what they called a Jew hunt. And there were then considerable scenes of disorder and violence. It's been described by some as a pogrom. I perhaps wouldn't go that far, but certainly there was targeted violence.
But that was the word that was used, wasn't it? I mean, the word pogrom was actually used by those criticizing what had happened in Amsterdam.
Yes. And what one should probably note about the result of that, obviously there's been arrests on both sides, I think, and injuries on both sides, but there were 7 taken to hospital. 5 of those were Israelis, and I think more of the arrests were on the Islamist, let's say, side. So it's true that this group arriving in a heavily Muslim area would be provoking, but what's quite likely is that the narrative that people like Ayub Khan, certainly, and people in his constituency will have heard about what happened in Ajax would have been extremely one-sided. And so, of course, the general way that they have tried to explain this decision when Ayub Khan, for instance, went on Newsnight on the night that it happened to the broader public has been to say, well, this is about safety. It's about the safety of the poor Muslim residents who are going to be intimidated and so on by these ultra-nationalist fans. Well, it's notable that this was his concern for safety seemed to be mostly on that side, but of course, very much mixed in with this, and speaking out the other side of their mouth there, they had all these other concerns about the legitimation of Israel as a state, and they obviously say that it's committing a genocide and everything else, and they say actually Israel should be totally banned from all football tournaments, for instance. So you have this mixing in with this potentially there's something to it, concern about safety, with these much broader political concerns, which certainly are not shared by the wider British public, or as it might be by some of them. And so to conflate the two is a little bit dishonest in many ways, and so that's why there's been so much concern and outrage at this decision, because it's very much seen that this kind of politics has gone into it, and what is essentially saying we don't want any Jews in our city because of what they represent, but basically because we hate them.
Yes, I mean, can we? You mentioned Millwall. Whatever the chant is nobody loves us and we don't care, isn't it? That's pure yobbery. Am I allowed to say that? That's pure yobbery. But there is another bit of the British Isles where there is something much nearer to this, which is the old tradition in Glasgow, isn't it? Where there is the remains of the intense Catholic, Protestant, and of course Ulster settler versus IRA tinged Fenianism in Glasgow, with the conflict between the two football teams of Celtic and Rangers. In other words, one of the things, again, that I think we'll need to explore here is the effective, if you like, as a result of the Islamic immigration, of the Muslim and to some extent Islamic immigration into Britain, that we are going down the route of Ulsterization, that we are literally going down the route of rival sectarian groups entrenched in specific areas, and entrenched not simply in areas in terms of living there, but actually controlling the state, the police, the local authority, and the political networks in those areas. In other words, statelets. I mean, I was in Northern Ireland recently, and I was astonished. I hadn't been in Northern Ireland. I hadn't been in Belfast for any length of time, actually, since the Troubles of the height of the Troubles of '72, when, of course, things were very, very terrible. There's a sort of peace now, but when I was driven around the areas of the Bogside and all the rest of it, the thing that struck me, and remember it's a tourist bus now, the thing that struck me was just how much the Middle Eastern conflict has been absorbed into the Protestant Catholic Ulster settler versus Sinn Féin versus IRA versus Irish nationalism. So in the Ulster Protestant areas, alongside the Union Jack, everywhere there is now the Star of David in Belfast. Everywhere, on the other hand, in the areas that are flying the Irish tricolour, in other words, the Sinn Féin, the Catholic areas, everywhere there is the Palestinian flag, and even the inscribed banners of Intifada and Holy War and whatever. Extraordinary.
And it's worth noting, I think, on just on those flags and what the Gaza and the Palestine flag means is that you might say that these groups and these sectarian MPs who campaigned for lend Gaza your vote is how one of their campaigns was described, or the slogan rather. And the question there is this just a sort of humanitarian concern about another part of the world, and they're just very suddenly, they're very interested in foreign politics, or foreign policy rather. That might be part of it, but equally, what this flag often represents is actually a sectarianism in and of itself, and a sense that we are a different group, and that's kind of what it means, and it can be even said to intimidate. There's a famous clip in Birmingham actually during those Muslim sectarian riots after the Southport unrest, where they come a few masked men on a bike come up to a Sky News reporter, and they are shouting at her, "Free Palestine, free Palestine," and it doesn't really seem to be very much about Palestine here. Rather, this is being used as a term, a way to intimidate and signal one's tribal identity.
I mean, it's a territorial definition, isn't it? And let's actually just again going back to Southport and to the reaction to Southport, because I think this is really important that we understand what happened. One of the most extraordinary scenes, I think it was in Jess Phillips' constituency, wasn't it? Which is in this area, was the moment where we saw a masked. Largely masked, wearing black, in tracksuits and this sort of thing, and bomber jackets and whatever, group of Muslims being addressed by a Muslim police officer. The Muslims were carrying sticks. They were carrying baseball bats. And what the Muslim police officer says to them is, "We know why you've gathered. We know that you are trying to protect your own communities. Now, we in the police force don't want to do anything unpleasant like arresting you, do we? We've also talked to the community leaders, haven't we? Why don't you be good boys and go back and put your weapons in the mosque? And we'll all go home and be very, very happy." Now, is that not directly connected to what we're talking about now? If you look at Ayub Khan, if you look at Mohammed Iqbal, if you look at Zara Sultana, if you look at one of the apparently key local figures on the safety involved with the safety advisory group, Wasum Zafir, these are all people who are in this network. There seems to be a network of local police officers high up into the police force, because clearly you could only say that if, I would imagine, people at chief constable level in the state of public outrage after Southport were involved in that, if local politicians were, if the police commissioner was. So we do seem to have, don't we? You talked about confusion. You talked about, is this about public safety? Is it about the assertion of communal independence? Is it, in other words, effectively a state within a statelet within a state? Is it straightforward, to be blunt, anti-Semitism to the point of, again, the cry of, from the river to the sea, which, as we all know, is a cry for the actual eradication of the state of Israel? Are we dealing then with movements now, localities now, that thanks to the election of their own MPs, the apparent control or infiltration of local police forces and the agencies of the state, and indeed a local football club, have assumed, dare one say, the mantle of a Muslim statelet within Britain? In other words, is a politician who went there very recently and was roundly condemned for what he said, is Robert Jenrick broadly right?
Certainly, there is that issue of two-tier policing and that issue of what is called community policing, and as you described it in that way, I wouldn't say that that certainly there are those links between Muslim MPs, Muslim police officers, say, and there's a lot of community pressure which the broad police hierarchy is very willing to listen to. Let's say.
Can we just pause there? Let me put another thing to you. Why is there a thing called a Muslim Police Officers Association, or indeed a Black Police Officers Association? You see, I think much of what's gone wrong is as a result of the catastrophic overreaction of the British state to the Stephen Lawrence affair. This notion that you should have a police force that reflects its local community. If you have a very large group of Muslim police officers, as that doctrine will mean you have in areas like Birmingham, where I gather now, I think the figure is an astonishing one, of the under 40 population, it is now Muslim majority, I think.
At least plurality, yeah.
In other words, effectively, the Muslim Police Officers Association may well comprise a majority of the local police force, mightn't it?
Well, I think they do nevertheless have difficulty recruiting, which is interesting. But the point I was actually going to go on to is that last year, when it fell to the police hierarchy to explain why they had taken this very hands-off approach, which one should not forget allowed a pub to be attacked,
Indeed.
a man hospitalized outside, and various other things. And a side note that all of those individuals who did it, some of them ended up getting charged with this. All of them got lower sentences than Lucy Connolly. But let's not get into two-tier sentencing today. But the question was, why had they been allowed to run amok? And it was a white senior police officer who the next day was saying, "Oh well, we had a discussion with our community and we decided about the style of policing that we wanted to have, and it was basically none at all." But so I do think that broadly, even if you're probably right that the rank and file coming up and the next generation will certainly be more diverse. That nevertheless.
No, sorry, I want to. Sorry, you're using, Laurie, you are copping out. You are using the language of the other side. They're not diverse. They are absolutely not diverse.
Well, I was using it ironically.
No, but it's really important we say this. So if there is a doctrine that the police force should, as it were, represent its local community, if that local community is politically and religiously organized, if the senior white leadership of the police force has done deals, can we again be quite clear? White people do not have community leaders. The majority population does not have community leaders. We do not. Can you imagine the reverse of the situation that I described with the weapons? Can you imagine the white police officer with the Millwall lads saying, "Now, come on, lads, do behave properly. Go and put your knuckle dusters away in the vestry. Do be careful not to disturb the cope and the chalice. I've had a nice word, with the local high church vicar, and he says it's absolutely, it becomes a satire." But the very absence of that is profoundly dangerous. It means that we have conceded special treatment. And what we are now seeing are the direct political consequences of that special treatment. We are seeing the state retreating. We are seeing at local level the state not simply retreating, but being complicit. And we're seeing our Prime Minister mouthing platitudes like "we must protect Jews," with absolutely no means of enforcing it. Are not all those statements true?
I would say certainly most of them. I think we can actually get into the question of whether they have the means of enforcing it in a second. Absolutely, you're right on that term diverse. So the reason I was using it, ironically, there is that yes, you one of the ways that this Birmingham constituency or area of it, but certainly the area immediately outside Villa Park, has been described is as diverse by and how could you be inflicting this conflict on a diverse area? But the actual statistic is not particularly diverse. Muslims comprise 70.2% of residents of Aston Park.
And whites?
It's very low, yeah. And white British in Birmingham broadly is 42.9%, and that was in 2021, so it's probably fallen since. So yeah, and we could also note that the level of segregation in that city is absolutely extraordinary. Sam Ashworth-Hayes in the Telegraph has been reporting on that, and what you see is basically a ring around the outside of the city of the more predominantly white areas, 80% plus. In the centre, it's completely white in the graph, but that there is basically no, less than 20% white in the city centre of Birmingham. And this is where, of course, you would have had actually the working class Aston Villa fans would have been coming from originally, the Peaky Blinders perhaps as well. But it's quite an extraordinary cultural change there. And I think I'd like to get onto that a bit because, of course, there are these questions about two-tier policing and whether the police took the right decision in terms of safety here. But it's been interesting that a lot of the outrage from even the centre-right commentariat about this issue has been focusing on the police. And I think, there are certainly rightful concerns about sectarianism and all of this, sensibilities towards these communities. But what is to some extent being missed, in my view, is the fact that, well, with this demographic reality, this is the outcome you're going to be getting. It's true, probably, that there would be an enormous riot if this did happen, or we would need hundreds of police officers to come in and make sure there wasn't one. And so, to some extent, to rage about the police's actions here is, in some ways, neither here nor there, because really all of this is downstream from the political decisions that allowed this demographic change to take place in the first place.
I would agree. I mean, there is an analogy, isn't there, Laurie? And we need to follow it through on the question of policing. You describe you describe a Muslim centre surrounded by affluent, leafy, white suburbs with large detached houses, the kind of places that I know my colleagues in the universities of Birmingham and Warwick and whatever live in, really very nice places. It sounds like America, doesn't it? Except we're not talking about blacks, we're talking about Muslims, but we are talking about white flight. And we are talking about the sorts of potential for violence, which is undoubtedly true in American cities. And this also, of course, raises the absolutely fundamental question about our police force. Our police force, the famously founded by Robert Peel on the principle of policing by consent, relied on an essentially homogeneous public. It relied on a powerful attachment to the notion of self-government and self-made law that reflected the the aspirations of a political community through Parliament. All of that has gone. Do we now need to admit this? Do we need, as the French have, as the Americans have, a highly aggressive, heavily armed police force that, unlike the poor lads in blue who get duffed up by both sides and these pathetic, female police officers sent into violent conflict. It's ludicrous. It's embarrassing. It makes a mockery of the police and of the British state. We're going to have to recognise this, aren't we? We need our CRS. We need, I'm afraid, a semi. I would desperately hope we avoid the need of the regular arming of the police, but we need a group of aggressive, well-trained, as virtually every continental state has, police force actually capable of holding the peace. And what you said is now surely true. If, in fact, Starmer gets his way and the Maccabees fans comes, we will have scenes of rioting, the like of which we have not seen. That's effectively what you're saying, isn't it?
Certainly very likely, yeah.
They'll be like the scenes in Amsterdam without water cannon, because we don't have them. And in other words, this is typical of the hideous mess we've got ourselves into in Britain, that we have brought about a gigantic transformation, not simply in the machinery of the state, the values that have, or the inversion of values that have led to two-tier policing, the extraordinary transformation in the nature of our population and its values, which has led to the destruction of that agreement on value that underpinned the idea of policing by consent, of an unarmed police force. All of these things have happened, and we've refused to confront the consequences.
Certainly, absolutely. And I think in some ways, this project of trying to make this happen is almost a sort of multiculturalist white elephant, in that they want to say, oh no, there aren't any problems in Birmingham, and we can have this go ahead. And what we have to do, therefore, is bring in hundreds and hundreds of police officers and make them pull overtime, make them maybe be bottled by people or worse, and pretend and somehow form this multicultural miracle and have there not be unrest. I think this is also very much linked for someone like Starmer. I mean, you and I have spoken before about how almost the sole element of popular culture in his mind is the footy, right? And this is seen as particularly offensive to the sensibilities of someone like Starmer and others who have, in recent years in particular, I know you're not a big football fan, David, but have politicized football significantly. So we've had rainbow laces, we've had kneeling for Black Lives Matter. Before that, we had kick it out, and this was seen by many as a way to bring people together and to say, oh look, well there are black
There
players in
is
the England
no
team.
room for racism in football. I mean, this absurd. Whenever you hear somebody say there is no room for, what you mean is the thing that there's no room for is absolutely rampant and is about to take over. But I mean, isn't it? I mean, I think in making that statement, you've said something really so seriously important. Again, in the world of Starmer, there are two terrible things that mustn't exist. There obviously mustn't be anti-Semitism, and there mustn't be Islamophobia. The trouble is, of course, that the people who are most guilty of Islamophobia are probably the Maccabi supporters, and the people who are certainly most guilty of anti-Semitism are significant part of the Muslim population of this country, and we need just to admit this. This entire red elephant, or rather black elephant of the far right, white elephant rather. I'm getting my colours confused in all this talk of football. This entire white elephant of the far right is totally irrelevant to this kind of question. But in the world of people like Starmer, they've got to try to believe it. They're believing in absolutely impossible things. The reason for again, there's very interesting studies, aren't there, been done since October the 7th in the astonishing rise of anti-Semitic attacks. We know why. And we've got to admit it. And people like Starmer and Mahood can't. Because, of course, it absolutely contradicts all the doctrines that they hold dear. Can we just shift now a little bit? Because I think we've teased this one out pretty well. But I think there's something bigger lying behind it all. And it is, how have we got so confused about what the state is supposed to be about? I had a very interesting conversation in the course of the week, and I don't think I'm going to name him because it might be embarrassing, with somebody who's been very prominent politically recently. And he was saying that he felt, when we talked about these kind of incidents, and we talked about two-tier justice, we talked about the Chinese spy case, and he said he thought that all these things had one central thing in common, which is that we've lost any clear sense of what it means to not only to be British, the kind of remarks of Robert Jenrick, and by the way, it was not Robert Jenrick, I need to clarify that, it could be easily thought that it was, but he said that he thought that what we needed to do was to redefine a test for everybody in public life, for anybody acquiring British citizenship, which would be a reworking in very precise terms of the old oath of allegiance, that you had to be clear that your central loyalty is to Britain. And I'd like to run that idea past you, but before you answer on it, I'd like you to think of the problem of doing it. And the problem of doing it, it seems to me, is once upon a time, your idea of allegiance to the crown, which is what we're talking about, was very clear. But now the crown itself has become very cloudy because, of course, Prince Charles, now King Charles, falls over himself to be nice to Islam. and to go out of his way. He falls over himself, despite the fact that he's leader of the Church of England and the direct heir, one way or another, of Henry VIII, to cozy up to the Pope. All sorts of the old rules that the monarchy once embodied have gone. At the same time, of course, to substitute for that notion of the oath to king and country, back in the 1990s, back in the 2000s, Tony Blair and more particularly Gordon Brown came up instead with this weird notion of the British nation and the key British values of tolerance and diversity. Now, how on earth can you swear an oath of allegiance to tolerance and diversity? Because, of course, tolerance and diversity is a flag of convenience. You can say you're as British as the next person, but you can drive every coach and horses through it. Isn't this the problem? On the one hand, the idea of swearing an oath of allegiance is centrally good. I mean, you have, people like Gus O'Donnell, the former permanent secretary of the Treasury, saying that he thought his responsibility wasn't simply the welfare of Britain, but the world welfare. This absurd internationalism of our elites. But how can we have a sense of fundamental loyalty to the British state, the absence of which I think is the key to so many of the stories that are floating around now, when the official doctrine, when the official values of the British state is this weird kind of sieve through which it's a mesh through which anything can go, tolerance and diversity. What do we do? I mean, how would you agree? We need the idea, a revived idea of swearing to, as it were, loyalty to the nation. It's extraordinary to say this, but that then means we've got to have some sort of clear idea of what the nation is, isn't it? I mean, maybe dare one say it even in ethnic terms.
Well, yes, I think one of the difficulties there is, I mean, you mentioned this sort of Blairite hollowing out of our national identity that's already happened, and indeed that happening or being done by Charles in particular. It happened to some extent under Elizabeth as well, but he has really made himself the defender of faiths,
Exactly.
and sort of invited people to comb through the royal archives to look at it in case there's any links with slavery, and it's another opportunity to sort of abase himself before woke. So to some extent, that already attenuates the significance of any oath to Charles or to the king, unfortunately. My main concern there is that in the way, I mean, we do have citizenship ceremonies, of course, and tests you have to pass and things like this, and you can find videos online of people really going through them and sort of mocking the whole idea and thinking, oh well, I just have to do this to get my indefinite leave to remain or anything else, or their benefits essentially. So I think this kind of thing would be unfortunately very open to abuse. And so to have this as the sort of only criteria one would need, I think would be probably a little too weak. I mean, you mentioned ethnicity there. I think that raises a lot of questions. But what one might talk about in terms of these, let's think about the sectarian Muslim MPs, for instance, of which I think we could go more into, but it's been very notable, as I mentioned at the start, how little heed they pay to wider society. And
None at all. Effective. They only invoke Britishness when it's convenient. And it is clear that they use their position in Britain to try to leverage British policy in favour of Palestine or Pakistan or an obscure airport in the Midipuri region of Pakistan or whatever. That they have absolutely no allegiance whatever to the wider British state. The British state is simply seen as a piggy bank that can be raided for their own purposes. It's not true.
And of course, the electoral dynamics here are very insidious. This is sectarian voting, and this is not voting, as we've mentioned, on any particular issue like the bins or like tax rates. They're not really engaging in wider democracy. They're just voting for sectarian reasons.
But can we also be clear why it's so deadly? And all of these things fit together, including, of course, the rape gangs and whatever. What we're really saying is when we talk about these as Islamic or when we talk about them as Muslim, I think that doesn't really grasp quite why they're so dangerous. It's again the work that's being highlighted at the moment by one or two very brave journalists and some very brave academics. In other words, these societies are clan societies. They are held together by first cousin marriage, with all the dreadful consequences, of course, in terms of the incidence of genetic disorder and inherited disease and so on. But what they mean essentially is these are close-knit groups which are absolutely hostile to the individualistic values on which our society is founded. And what is moreover, the very fact that they're a group, they're a group dynamic, a group ethic. In other words, they have no notion of individual responsibility. There is no notion of an individual duty to the state. Everything is the family and the extended family, which is the clan. And the trouble is, groups like this exercise tremendous power within our fragmented individualistic state. Because, of course, you've got to ask why do we have so many Muslim politicians? The answer is because they command voting blocks. The clans act as voting blocks. The individuals, the junior members of the clan, particularly the women and the whatever, simply vote as they are directed. Our notion of individual responsibility. Again, look at that extraordinary incident between the police officers, the yet unresolved case between the police officers and the two Pakistani men who were defending their mother's honor. There is absolutely no notion of individual behavior. It is a collective enforcement of things that to us are foreign, like honor. Like the honor of the family, the honor particularly of the women of the family, which of course involves forms of, to our eyes, also of extreme repression. But Britain triumphed by getting rid of this, hence, frankly, the clans, the Highland clearances and whatever, the extraordinary attacks of the Tudor state on the border clans, the Reaver clans, which were exactly the same, the whole role of both the Catholic and the Anglican Church in the resistance of cousin marriage and so on, in the resistance to cousin marriage. All of this leading to the extraordinarily delicate balance of our state of individual values on the one hand and a collective sense of identity on the other. But that delicate balance is so easily torn apart. It simply becomes a solid voting bloc, which is guaranteed to return one of these MPs. But also, it is the fact that you then capture the entire machinery of government. You capture the police force. You capture social services. You capture the town hall. And again, none of these things have been sayable or describable. We are now confronting the consequences when we've let them happen. How on earth are we to undo them?
Well, they can be said a little in that people obviously do point to the problem of sectarianism, the problem of segregation in cities, and so on. And I think from that fact that these independent MPs are they silo themselves, but they are also shunned, and all of these attendant problems as you've laid out there, that's very much acknowledged. And we could really take a leaf out of Denmark's book here, where we would very much call this an ethnic ghetto, quite straightforwardly. Denmark likewise does that with parts of its cities that have become, had a sizable non-ethnically Danish population. But that's not merely just a sort of criticism. That's actually a legal term, and that introduces various duties on these areas to reduce the ghettoization,
I mean,
reduce
come on,
the extent
Laurie,
of.
stop using this abstract language. What the Danes are doing is moving people out. They are breaking up these areas of these mono blocks of of Muslim clans. That's what they're doing. In other words, it's exactly the same as the Highland clearances or the attacks on the Reaver clans in the early modern period. You've actually got to break up the structure, which involves moving people. Can you see the British state doing that?
Well, certainly not at the moment, but I think with
But you know,
this.
you talked, you will forgive my saying so, glibly of Denmark. Can you imagine a Starmer state which can't even control our frontiers, seriously considering how you deal with this? But again, we have to admit, don't we, that so long as we allow these concentrations to exist, these what we can now call, I think we should start calling them clan constituencies. When we have these clan constituencies, there is nothing we can, again be completely frank, there is nothing we can do about two-tier policing. There is nothing we can do to protect the rights of Jews in those areas. There is nothing we can do about the rape gangs. They will all continue. In other words, this is now entrenched and is irremovable without that a degree of political courage, which no one. I mean, you listen frankly to Nigel Farage. He steers as far clear from this as it's possible. Does he not?
Well, let's steer towards it ourselves then, shall we, David? I mean, you're quite right that there's going to be no will for this kind of thing under Starmer, but I think we are heading towards that characterization of such places, as you say, of a clan constituency would be one way to put it. But if you can get that designation and get people to think about why this is a problem in and of itself, rather than, I mean, even Robert Jenrick, I mean, he was quite right to point out the what he called integration problems in Handsworth, but in many ways, all he's doing there is sort of gesturing towards something in the most politically correct way he can. It's not really an integration problem. There's never going to be any integration. I mean, the way he signed off this week was the time has come for muscular action to make integration a reality. Now, there is, frankly, this is a. What did he mean by that? One could tag a lot onto it, but that if you can, in a more broader and longer term project, find a way of defining legally what it means to be a clan constituency and say that this is actually not conducive to the good of the nation as a whole, and this is not what we were aiming for, let's say, when we started our experiment to rub the right's nose in diversity, or even before that, that this is unconducive to the public good, then doesn't solve things in itself, but there's at least a sense of, okay, well, this is the social problem and we know it's going to be there, and we're not going to tie it all up, try and make bring the Israelis in and have the police, assemble in their hundreds to have a sort of Blairite, kumbaya ceremony to say, actually, no, everything's fine, diversity is our strength, and there's no problems here at all, because clearly there are.
I mean, just going back to the problem of Robert's approach, and I rate Robert and I like him a lot. When you talk about integration, you of course leave yourself open to the immediate. What I call the left at the moment is very, very good at false equivalence. So if you get Isabella Oakeshott talking about people in Britain not actually speaking English, they all say, well, when you're in Dubai, do you speak Arabic? As though there was any possible comparison between the two situations. Well, when Robert uses the word integration, the immediate response has been, oh, come on, Mr. Jenrick, when you go to your favourite clubs in London, and I go to quite a few of them myself, do you encounter many Muslims? And the answer is, of course, not. But what we've got to do is to say that is simply false equivalence. We are not talking about integration. What we are talking about is people who are prepared to accept the broad social, political, and economic values of the majority. That's the key thing. In other words, we've got to do it. We've got to talk about these things in a way which makes absolutely clear that the responsibility is upon the immigrant and the immigrant groups. Again, there've been extraordinary scenes. I'm trying to remember the name of the particularly silly Guardian journalist who's gone out of my head, who said, isn't the responsibility of the white community to integrate foreigners just as just as important as foreigners to integrate into Britain? The answer is no, it is not. There is no comparison, and our structures of state cannot take clan groupings. They simply cannot. And the thing that's terrifying about them is, as I was saying before, the power which those clan groupings have to undercut the values, the functionings, the operations, the very safety of the majority.
It is interesting to me that there are, Starmer is a proceduralist. He's a lawyer. He wants to follow exactly what the independent institutions tell him to do all the time, except for certain moments. So we saw, for instance, the Home Office going against the ruling that they had to close the Epping Asylum Hotel. So he'll do it to um, to prop up the failing asylum system. He did it, of course, last year with the Southport unrest to launch this brutal crackdown, which was very, very politicized. And now he did it, in his words, because this was a fundamental issue of fairness. And so he's going to be trying to put a lot of pressure on the local police and various other government bodies to make this match go ahead. And so it seems that, there is something to the man after all, and that is his credo. David, is fundamental issues of fairness, which is a suitably vacuous Starmerite phrase in my view.
Do you think he will push it to the point of forcing it through? Because if he forces it through and there is major disorder, there's then no doubt who is responsible, is there? And it will be extraordinarily difficult to blame the bogeyman of the far right. I mean, do you think he will? We know he's a political ass, but do you think he is so committed to these notions that he will take that risk, that people round him who have a little, more savvy than he does? I mean, you think of it. When is the match due?
6th of November.
Right. Oh, there's quite some time away, isn't there? But if you think of it, if he actually, against the wishes of what will be a very significant portion of the Labour Party, because the Labour Party is still desperate to try to stop the leakage of the Muslim vote to the independents. It will be against highly structured opposition from the Greens, from the Fruit and Nut Party, and all the rest of it. But above all, it will put all of those things that you're talking about absolutely on the line. You were able to, you've been able to deal with Southport. You were able to deal with the riots in Southport. You've been able to deal with the Islamic hotels, with the myth. Oh, it's the far right. The implication, it's all Farage. This incident, this football match, actually goes to the very heart of the myth of multiculturalism. Surely, if you were advising him, if I were advising him, I know what I'd do. He's got to make the most tremendous noise about it, and then subtly back down in the face of serious advice from the police. And you'll have assorted commissioners wheeled in to explain the terrible risk of violence, and we'll need a Church of England bishop to pop up. She or presumably they could find a transsexual that would. I think a transsexual in a mitre would be a wonderful sight to behold. We'll have to explain the risks to community cohesion, and at which point there will be a graceful backing off. I mean, shall we predict? Are you a betting man? What's the bet Starmer is actually going to force those Maccabees fans into that stadium? Do you think he's got the courage?
I think he actually might. I think he might be that, brave and foolish. I mean, he does, for instance, he knows how to corral the institutions of the state into doing something like this, as he did as
True.
DPP. So, and last year, of course. So, I think he might actually try and do it. So it'll be Keir's riot if that happens.
That's a wonderful thought, isn't it? Shall we break and cherish the notion that maybe November 6th will be the day of the fall of Keir? Yes.
Indeed, indeed. Well, that's certainly a cheerful note to end on.
Tremendous, Laurie. Thank you so much.
Thank you.